Imagine the clang of swords on a misty battlefield, the chants of monks echoing through stone cathedrals, and the whispers of kings and queens plotting in candlelit chambers. This is not just a story. It's the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth of legends, and the forging of a nation. Tonight, you will fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England, a journey through centuries of war, faith, and power struggles. But here's the question. Was medieval England truly a world of darkness and despair, or was it the very foundation of the England we know today? Stay with me, and let's find out together. The dawn of medieval England, c. 5th to 11th century. Close your eyes, drift back through time, and let your mind wander to a land of misty hills, stone churches, and echoes of battles long faded. This is fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England, a story that begins at the very end of the Roman world. When Rome withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the island was left vulnerable. The legions, once the backbone of order, marched away to defend the heart of the empire. In their absence, chaos and uncertainty spread. The Roman towns crumbled, trade routes broke down, and local tribes fought for survival. Into this vacuum came new peoples, sailing across the cold waters of the North Sea. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, Germanic tribes from what is now Denmark and northern Germany, began to settle. At first, they were hired as mercenaries to protect the weakened Britons from raiders. But soon, they carved out their own kingdoms. This was the birth of Anglo-Saxon England. For centuries, these new settlers reshaped the island. They brought their own languages, their own gods, their own way of life. The native Britons, pushed into the western fringes, Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland, watched as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms grew. By the 7th century, England was a patchwork of small, competing realms. Historians call this era the Heptarchy, meaning the Seven Kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Life in these kingdoms was simple but harsh. Wooden halls replaced Roman villas. Farmers toiled in open fields, their work tied to the cycles of the seasons. Warriors swore loyalty to their lords, while poets sang of heroes and gods around smoky fires. And slowly, Christianity began to spread across this land. Missionaries from Ireland and from Rome traveled through the forests and meadows, carrying the message of a new faith. Kings converted, monasteries were built, and with them came the revival of learning and art. By the 8th century, England was dotted with shining centers of culture like the monastery at Lindisfarne. Here, monks illuminated manuscripts with dazzling colors, creating works like the Lindisfarne Gospels, blending Anglo-Saxon art with Christian devotion. Yet peace was fragile, always under threat. In the year 793, terror arrived from the sea. Longships cut through the waves, their dragon-headed prows striking fear into all who saw them. The Vikings had come. The first major raid struck Lindisfarne itself, the Holy Island. Monks were slain, treasures were stolen, and the world of Anglo-Saxon England changed forever. For decades, Viking raiders and settlers poured into England. They burned towns, looted monasteries, and carved out their own territories. The eastern part of the island fell under what became known as the Danelaw, a region ruled by Norse law, not Anglo-Saxon law. Yet, amid this chaos, heroes emerged. Perhaps the most famous was Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. In the late 9th century, he faced overwhelming Viking invasions. His kingdom shrank until it seemed on the verge of collapse. But Alfred did not yield. He reorganized his armies, built fortified towns called Buzz, and even created a navy to challenge Viking ships at sea. Through clever tactics and determination, Alfred held his kingdom together. Alfred was not only a warrior king, but also a scholar. He believed deeply in education and sought to preserve learning in a time of darkness. He translated important Latin texts into Old English, making knowledge available to his people. Because of his efforts, he earned the rare title of the Great, the only English king to bear it. After Alfred's death in 899, his descendants continued his struggle. Slowly, the Anglo-Saxon kings reconquered the Danelaw, uniting more and more of England under their rule. By the mid-10th century, Athelstan, Alfred's grandson, achieved what no one had before. He became the first king of all England. His reign marked the beginning of a truly united kingdom. But the Viking threat never fully disappeared. Waves of invaders returned in the 10th and 11th centuries, demanding tribute, known as Danegeld, to spare English towns from destruction. Some kings, like Athelred the Unready, struggled to hold the kingdom together. His very name reflects his troubled reign, unready meaning ill-advised, rather than unprepared. By the early 11th century, the Vikings had grown so powerful that they seized the English throne itself. Knut the Great, a Danish king, ruled over a vast North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. Remarkably, his rule brought a period of stability. Knut respected English customs and laws, marrying into the royal family and presenting himself as a Christian king, as well as a conqueror. Yet after his death, his empire fractured. The English crown returned briefly to the native line with Edward the Confessor, a pious and gentle king remembered for building the great Westminster Abbey, which still stands today. But Edward's death in 1066, without a clear heir, unleashed one of the most famous struggles in English history. 3 rivals claimed the throne. Harold Godwin's son, the powerful Earl of Wessex, was chosen by the English nobles. William, Duke of Normandy, insisted that Edward had promised him the crown, and Harald Hardrada of Norway, the fierce Viking king, sought to reclaim England for the Norse. In September of 1066, Harald Hardrada invaded from the north. Harold, Godwin's son, rushed to meet him, and at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold won a stunning victory. Hardrada was slain, his Viking army destroyed. But even as Harold celebrated, news arrived that William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. Only weeks later, Harold and his weary army marched south to face this new threat. On the fields near Hastings, the two sides clashed in one of the most decisive battles in English history. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, ended with the death of Harold and the triumph of William. With his victory, William became William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England. The Norman Conquest transformed England forever. Castles of stone rose across the countryside, symbols of Norman power. French became the language of the court and the nobility, blending with Old English to shape the language we now call Middle English. Feudalism tightened its grip, binding peasants to the land under lords and kings. And a vast survey known as the Domesday Book recorded the wealth of the kingdom, a testament to William's desire to control every detail. Thus ended the Anglo-Saxon Age and began the Norman era, a turning point in the long journey of medieval England. The story from here will unfold through centuries of kings and queens, wars and plagues, monasteries and markets, struggles and triumphs. This is only the beginning of fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England, the dawn of a medieval kingdom that will grow, falter, and rise again in the centuries to come. The Norman era and the rise of royal power, 11th to 12th century. The death of Harold Godwin's son at Hastings and the victory of William of Normandy in 1066 did not immediately guarantee peace. The conquest of England was not a single battle, but a long process of resistance, suppression, and transformation. In the years that followed Hastings, William the Conqueror had to fight fiercely to hold what he had gained. Rebellions broke out across the north and west, where English lords resisted the new Norman rule. To crush them, William unleashed brutal campaigns, most famously the Harrying of the North, where villages were burned, crops destroyed, and thousands left to starve. It was ruthless, but it cemented Norman control. Once secured, William and his barons began reshaping England in their image. The landscape changed dramatically. The Normans built castles, towering symbols of military power and authority, from the great fortress of the Tower of London to smaller Motte and Bailey structures scattered across the countryside. These castles were more than strongholds. They were reminders to the English people of who now ruled. The Normans also reorganized society under the system of feudalism. The king granted lands to his most loyal nobles, who in turn swore fealty to him and provided soldiers. Below them were knights who fought when called upon, and at the very bottom were peasants or serfs tied to the land. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely swept away, replaced by Norman lords. Language, too, shifted. The court and nobility spoke Norman French, while the common people continued to speak Old English. Over time, the two blended, creating the foundations of Middle English. Everyday words like sheep and cow survived from Old English, while words related to cooking, law, and government, like mutton, beef, justice, and counsel, came from French. This mixture would eventually form the rich vocabulary of modern English. William's rule was one of tight control. To measure the wealth and resources of his new kingdom, he ordered a vast survey in 1086, known as the Domesday Book. This remarkable document recorded who owned each piece of land, what it was worth, how many animals grazed upon it, and even how many beehives were kept. It was both a record of power and a tool for taxation. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in Europe at the time. William's descendants, however, would find that ruling England was never easy. After his death in 1087, his son William II, known as William Rufus, inherited the throne. His reign was marked by conflict with both the church and the nobility. He expanded Norman control into Wales and Scotland, but was unpopular and mistrusted. In 1100, he was killed by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest, a death some whispered was no accident. The crown then passed to William's younger brother, Henry I. Henry proved a shrewd and capable ruler. He strengthened royal administration and issued the Charter of Liberties, a promise of fair governance that foreshadowed later English law. Yet dynastic troubles plagued him. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. This tragedy left Henry without a male heir, setting the stage for a future civil war. When Henry died in 1135, his daughter, Empress Matilda, claimed the throne. But many nobles refused to accept a woman as ruler and instead supported Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Thus began nearly 2 decades of chaos, known as the Anarchy. Castles sprang up everywhere as rival lords fought for dominance. Chroniclers describe the land as plagued by lawlessness and suffering, where Christ and his saints slept. After years of stalemate, a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king for life, but Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, would inherit after him. When Stephen died in 1154, the young man ascended as Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet dynasty, ushering in one of the most significant reigns in England's medieval history. Henry II was an energetic, determined ruler. He sought to restore royal authority after the disorder of the anarchy. He expanded the justice system, introducing traveling royal judges who carried the king's law into every shire. This laid the foundation for what became known as English common law, a system that survives in many forms even today. Yet Henry's reign was not without turmoil. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, brought vast French lands under his control, creating an Angevin empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But such vast holdings also meant endless conflict with France. Henry's greatest domestic crisis, however, came from his clash with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Once Henry's close friend and chancellor, Becket became Archbishop in 1162. But instead of supporting the king's reforms, Becket defended the independence of the church. Their quarrel deepened into open hostility. In 1170, after years of bitter conflict, 4 of Henry's knights murdered Becket inside Canterbury Cathedral, shocking Christendom. Though Henry denied ordering the killing, he was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury while monks scourged him. Becket was canonized as a saint, and Canterbury became a major site of pilgrimage. Despite this, Henry maintained strong rule, but his later years were consumed by rebellion. His own sons, urged on by their mother Eleanor, rose against him. The king who had built such a vast empire died weary and betrayed in 1189, his last words filled with bitterness. Henry's eldest surviving son, Richard I, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, succeeded him. Richard became legendary not for ruling England. He spent only a handful of months in his kingdom, but for his role in the Third Crusade. Leaving England in the hands of ministers, Richard sailed east to fight in the Holy Land. His courage and skill in battle won admiration, but the crusade failed to retake Jerusalem. On his return, Richard was captured and held for ransom in Germany. England was forced to pay a huge sum to free him, draining its resources. Richard spent his final years fighting in France and died in 1199 from a crossbow wound, leaving the throne to his younger brother, John. John's reign would prove one of the most infamous in English history. He lost almost all the Angevin lands in France, earning him the nickname John Lackland. His heavy taxation and arbitrary rule alienated the nobility. Worst of all, his quarrel with Pope Innocent III led to England being placed under interdict, meaning no church services or sacraments could be performed across the kingdom. People feared for their souls while their king fought with the papacy. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They rebelled against John and forced him to sign a document at Runnymede, the Magna Carta. Though John tried to annul it almost immediately, the Magna Carta became a cornerstone of English liberty. It established the principle that the king was not above the law, that he must consult his barons before imposing taxes, and that subjects had certain rights. Though few at the time realized its importance, Magna Carta would echo through the centuries, inspiring struggles for liberty across the world. Thus, by the early 13th century, England had been utterly reshaped, from the Norman Conquest to the establishment of Magna Carta. Power had shifted, kings had risen and fallen, and the foundations of law and governance were being laid. The journey of fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England now moves forward into an age of barons and battles, parliaments and plagues, as the Plantagenet dynasty continues to define the fate of the kingdom. The Plantagenet struggles and the 100 Years' War, 13th to 14th century. When King John died in 1216, England was in turmoil. His young son, Henry III, only 9 years old, inherited the throne. A regency council guided the kingdom through these uncertain times, and slowly, stability returned. But Henry's long reign, stretching more than 50 years, would be marked by both devotion and division. Henry was deeply pious. He poured his energy into rebuilding Westminster Abbey on a grand scale, transforming it into the Gothic masterpiece we know today. He adored elaborate ceremonies, art, and architecture. Yet his love of splendor came at a cost. Heavy taxation, favoritism toward foreign advisors, and his failure to control his powerful barons created deep resentment. By the mid-13th century, the barons demanded greater influence over government. This led to the emergence of Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who rose in rebellion against the king. In 1264, civil war erupted, known as the Second Barons' War. At first, de Montfort triumphed, even capturing the king and effectively ruling in his name. In 1265, he called a gathering of not only nobles and bishops, but also representatives from towns. This assembly is often seen as a precursor to the English Parliament. But de Montfort's power was short-lived. That same year, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham. Still, his ideas could not be undone. The concept of a representative parliament would take root, shaping the governance of England in the centuries ahead. After Henry III's death in 1272, his son Edward I took the throne. Edward was a formidable and determined ruler, remembered as one of the most powerful medieval kings. He sought to extend royal authority across the entire British Isles. His campaigns in Wales were brutal but decisive. By the end of the 13th century, Wales was firmly under English control. Edward built massive stone castles, such as Conwy, Carnarvon, and Harlech, fortresses that still dominate the Welsh landscape. Edward also turned his attention to Scotland, seeking to assert overlordship there. But his attempts sparked fierce resistance. Out of this struggle rose legendary figures, such as William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Though Edward won several battles, the Scottish wars dragged on, and his dream of uniting Britain under his crown remained incomplete. At home, Edward strengthened the role of Parliament. He summoned representatives more regularly, using them to approve taxation and strengthen the king's legitimacy. The English legal system also grew under his reign, reinforcing the sense of order and stability. Edward died in 1307, leaving the crown to his son, Edward II. Where the father had been strong and determined, the son was weak and indecisive. Edward II alienated his nobles by showering favor on a handful of companions, especially Piers Gaveston, whose arrogance provoked the anger of powerful lords. Discontent boiled into open revolt. The barons forced Edward to exile Gaveston, and when he returned, they captured and executed him. The king's authority crumbled further after his disastrous defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce secured Scotland's independence. The nobility eventually rose against Edward himself. Led by his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, the rebels deposed Edward in 1327. He became the first English king formally deposed, imprisoned, and later killed in murky circumstances. His death shrouded in grim legend. The crown then passed to his young son, Edward III, who would reign for 50 years and restore the monarchy's prestige. Edward III was ambitious, martial, and determined to revive England's power. His reign marked the beginning of one of the most famous conflicts in medieval history, the 100 Years' War. The roots of the war lay in dynastic claims. Through his mother, Edward III claimed the throne of France. In 1337, after disputes over territories and homage, he declared himself rightful king of France, sparking a war that would stretch on, with interruptions, for more than a century. The early phase of the war brought England remarkable victories. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen devastated French knights. The new weapon, the longbow, could pierce armor and fire rapidly, breaking the dominance of heavy cavalry. This triumph was followed by the capture of Calais, which became England's foothold on the continent for centuries. Perhaps the most celebrated moment came in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers, where Edward's son, known as the Black Prince, captured the French king himself, John II. These victories made England seem unbeatable, and Edward's claim to France appeared within reach. Yet, while the war raged abroad, disaster struck at home. In 1348, the Black Death arrived. Carried by fleas on rats, the plague swept across England, killing perhaps a third to half of the population. Entire villages were abandoned, fields went untilled, and despair gripped the land. The social impact was immense. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Surviving peasants found themselves in demand and began to demand higher wages. The old feudal system started to crack under the strain. The government tried to freeze wages with laws like the Statute of Laborers, but resentment grew. As the century progressed, England's fortunes shifted. France, under leaders like Charles V, began to recover, while Edward III aged and his vigor declined. Still, his reign had seen both glory and tragedy, shaping the very heart of medieval England. The constant wars, the devastation of the plague, and the growing unrest among the lower classes all set the stage for further upheavals. The Plantagenet dynasty, though mighty, was not unshakable. Thus, as the 14th century drew on, the kingdom stood at a crossroads, victorious yet exhausted, rich in culture yet torn by suffering, confident in its kings yet vulnerable to rebellion. This long journey of fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England now moves forward into an age of peasants' revolts, dynastic struggles, and the beginnings of civil war, the turbulent later Middle Ages. Revolts, Richard II, and the Wars of the Roses, 14th to 15th century. By the late 14th century, England was weary. The 100 Years' War dragged on, the Black Death had scarred the land, and the common people began to question the heavy burdens laid upon them. These strains erupted in 1381 in one of the most dramatic uprisings of medieval Europe, the Peasants' Revolt. The spark came from taxation. The government, desperate to fund wars in France, imposed repeated poll taxes that fell heavily on the poor. Resentment boiled over, and in villages across the southeast, men and women rose in rebellion. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical priests such as John Ball, who preached that all men were created equal, the rebels marched on London. Tens of thousands entered the city, burning records, storming palaces, and demanding an end to serfdom and oppressive laws. In a remarkable moment, the young king, Richard II, only 14 years old, faced a crowd at Smithfield. He promised reforms and persuaded the rebels to disperse. But when their leader, Wat Tyler, was slain in a scuffle, the uprising collapsed. Richard's promises were revoked, and vengeance fell upon the villages that had risen. Yet the revolt left a mark. It revealed that the old order was no longer unquestioned, that even peasants could challenge the might of kings. Richard II's reign would remain troubled. He came to the throne as a child in 1377, inheriting not only war, but deep political divisions. As he grew older, he showed flashes of charm and intelligence, but also a dangerous streak of arrogance. He relied heavily on favorites, sidelining the great lords of the realm. Tensions erupted in the 1380s when a group of nobles, the Lords Appellant, curbed Richard's power and executed several of his allies. Though Richard later regained control and exacted revenge, his autocratic tendencies alienated many. He surrounded himself with splendor, demanding almost divine reverence for his kingship, a style far ahead of his time, but out of place in a realm used to cooperation between king and nobility. In 1399, Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, seized the opportunity. After Richard disinherited him, Henry returned from exile, gathered support, and forced the king to abdicate. Richard was imprisoned and later died in captivity, likely starved to death. Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV, founding the Lancastrian dynasty. Henry IV faced rebellions from the start. Powerful nobles resented his usurpation, while Welsh leader Owain Glynwr launched a spirited uprising, proclaiming himself Prince of Wales. Though Henry managed to hold on, much of his reign was consumed by instability and ill health. His son, Henry V, who became king in 1413, transformed England's fortunes. Unlike his father, Henry was vigorous, decisive, and utterly committed to war in France. His reign is immortalized in both history and Shakespeare's plays. In 1415, Henry launched a campaign across the Channel, culminating in the Battle of Agincourt. On a muddy October day, vastly outnumbered English troops faced the French. Once again, the longbow proved devastating. French knights, weighed down by armor and bogged in the mud, fell in droves. The English victory was astonishing, and Henry's reputation soared. Over the next decade, Henry pursued conquest relentlessly. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, he was recognized as heir to the French throne, marrying Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. It seemed England might truly rule both realms, but fate intervened. In 1422, Henry died suddenly at only 35, leaving his infant son as king. Thus began the troubled reign of Henry VI. Crowned as both King of England and France while still a child, Henry inherited a kingdom stretched thin. His gentle, pious nature was ill-suited to the brutal realities of war and politics. As he grew older, it became clear he lacked his father's strength. Under his rule, the English position in France crumbled. By 1453, after decades of fighting, England lost almost all its French territories, holding only Calais. The dream of an English France had collapsed. Worse still, that same year, Henry VI suffered a mental breakdown, leaving him incapable of ruling. Power struggles erupted between rival factions of the nobility. At the center of the storm was the mighty House of York, whose leader, Richard, Duke of York, had a strong claim to the throne. When Henry's French-born queen, Margaret of Anjou, sought to defend her husband's crown, England descended into civil war. Thus began the Wars of the Roses, named for the emblems of the two rival houses, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. Battles flared across the kingdom as loyalties shifted and kings were made and unmade on the field. At first, the Yorkists triumphed. Richard of York's son became Edward IV after a decisive victory at Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. Edward was tall, charismatic, and militarily skilled. His reign, however, was marked by turbulence. Though he secured the throne, Lancastrian resistance lingered, and rivalries among his allies sowed discord. Edward was briefly overthrown in 1470 when his former ally, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, restored Henry VI to the throne. But Edward swiftly returned, defeated his enemies, and reasserted control. In 1471, Henry VI was captured and killed in the Tower of London, ending the direct Lancastrian line. Edward IV's later years brought relative peace and prosperity. He fostered trade, patronized the arts, and strengthened royal authority. Yet upon his death in 1483, the crown passed to his young son, Edward V. The boy's fate remains one of history's great mysteries. Placed in the Tower of London for safekeeping, Edward V and his younger brother vanished. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared them illegitimate and took the throne as Richard III. Many believe the princes were murdered, though by whom remains uncertain. Richard ruled for only 2 years, but his reign became infamous, remembered through Tudor propaganda as cruel and tyrannical. In 1485, Richard faced a challenger, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with a tenuous right to the crown, but strong support from those weary of war. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard fought bravely but was slain. Henry was crowned Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. The Wars of the Roses had ended. England, battered by decades of civil war, longed for peace. Under the Tudors, a new age was dawning, one that would gradually lead England out of the medieval world and into the beginnings of the Renaissance. Thus, the journey of Fall Asleep to the entire history of medieval England carries us from peasant uprisings and turbulent kings to the closing of the Middle Ages, with a new dynasty poised to transform the kingdom. The story of Fall Asleep to the entire history of medieval England now moves into the late Middle Ages, a period that carried both glory and ruin, triumph and devastation. The seeds planted by the Norman Conquest, by Magna Carta, and by the Plantagenet dynasty now bore strange and often bitter fruit. The 14th and 15th centuries would test England in ways few could imagine, through wars abroad, plagues at home, dynastic rivalries, and social upheaval that reshaped the very fabric of the kingdom. When Edward III took the throne in 1327, England was restless. His father, Edward II, had been deposed and murdered, leaving behind a shaken realm. Yet Edward III would attempt to bring back stability through chivalry, warfare, and a revival of English pride. It was during his reign that England truly began to stand on the European stage with boldness and to clash with its greatest rival, France, in a war that seemed endless, the 100 Years' War. Edward III revived the glory of kingship. He launched campaigns into Scotland and France, and his claim to the French crown sparked the opening chapter of the 100 Years' War in 1337. For decades, this conflict would dominate English politics and society. Victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 stunned Europe. At Crécy, English longbowmen devastated the flower of French chivalry. At Poitiers, Edward's son, known as the Black Prince, captured the French king himself. For a time, it seemed as if the tide of fortune flowed England's way. The 100 Years' War, however, was no quick conflict. It was not one continuous battle, but rather a series of campaigns, truces, and resumptions of fighting spread across more than a century. Though the victories of Edward III and the Black Prince are legendary, England would never permanently secure control over France. What these wars did achieve, though, was the forging of a stronger sense of English identity. For the first time, the English language began to reclaim its dominance in court and culture, replacing Norman French. The English longbow became a symbol of national pride, and a shared sense of being English grew stronger as the country united in war against a common foe. But war was not the only trial of this age. In 1348, catastrophe struck, the arrival of the Black Death. This plague swept across Europe and reached England with terrifying speed. Entire villages vanished, wiped out by disease. Some chroniclers claimed that half the population perished, though modern estimates suggest perhaps a third died within a few years. Whatever the precise toll, the impact was devastating. The Black Death transformed England's society. With so many dead, laborers were suddenly scarce. Peasants realized their work was valuable and began demanding better wages and conditions. The ruling elite resisted, passing harsh laws like the Statute of Laborers in 1351 to freeze wages. But discontent simmered, and over time, the balance of power between lord and peasant shifted. The feudal system, which had defined England since the Norman Conquest, began to weaken. This tension would explode later in the century during the reign of Richard II, the grandson of Edward III. Richard inherited the throne as a child in 1377, just as England was struggling with the costs of endless war and the lingering effects of the plague. Taxation became unbearable, especially the hated poll tax levied on rich and poor alike. In 1381, revolt erupted. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 remains one of the most dramatic uprisings in English history. Led by figures such as Wat Tyler and the priest John Ball, thousands of common people marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, fair treatment, and justice. They stormed the capital, executed royal officials, and presented their demands directly to the young king. Richard II, then only 14, displayed surprising courage in meeting the rebels personally. For a brief moment, it seemed that sweeping reform might be achieved. But when Wat Tyler was killed in a skirmish, the rebellion lost its leader, and Richard reneged on his promises. Brutal reprisals followed. Yet, though the revolt was crushed, the message was clear. The common people of England had found their voice, and the old order was forever weakened. Richard II's reign remained turbulent. He was a cultured and artistic king, patron of poets like Geoffrey Chaucer. But politically, he was insecure and prone to tyranny. By 1399, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. With this usurpation, the crown passed from the Plantagenet line into the cadet branch known as the House of Lancaster. Henry IV's reign was uneasy, plagued by rebellion and illness. Yet his son, Henry V, would restore the glory of the monarchy in spectacular fashion. Henry V, one of the most famous warrior kings in English history, reignited the Hundred Years' War. In 1415, he led his army into France and achieved a miraculous victory at Agincourt. Once again, the English longbow proved decisive, cutting down waves of French knights. Henry's triumph cemented his reputation as a heroic leader, immortalized later by Shakespeare's plays. For a time, it seemed as if Henry V might succeed where his predecessors had failed. Through diplomacy and conquest, he forced the French King Charles VI to recognize him as heir to the French throne. England and France were briefly united under his rule. But Henry's early death in 1422, at only 36 years old, left the dream unfinished. His infant son, Henry VI, inherited the crown, and with it, a realm divided and fragile. Henry VI was a gentle and pious man, but wholly unsuited to rule. During his reign, the English hold on France crumbled. Joan of Arc inspired French resistance, and one by one, English possessions across the Channel were lost. By 1453, only Calais remained under English control. The dream of an Anglo-French empire had collapsed. At home, Henry VI's weakness invited disorder. His bouts of mental illness left the kingdom leaderless, and powerful nobles vied for dominance. The result was civil war, the Wars of the Roses. This brutal conflict, beginning in 1455, pitted the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, against the House of York, symbolized by the white. For decades, England would be torn apart by shifting alliances, bloody battles, and ruthless ambition. The Wars of the Roses were more than just a dynastic squabble. They represented the collapse of royal authority itself. Great magnates raised private armies, and lawlessness spread. Battles such as Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest fought on English soil, left thousands dead. Kings were deposed and restored in dizzying succession. First, Henry VI lost his throne to Edward IV of York, then regained it briefly, only to lose it again. Eventually, Henry was murdered in the Tower of London. By the late 15th century, the conflict narrowed to a final showdown. Edward IV secured the Yorkist crown, but died unexpectedly, leaving his young son, Edward V, vulnerable. The boy king and his brother, known as the Princes in the Tower, mysteriously disappeared. Their fate one of the great mysteries of English history. Their uncle seized the throne as Richard III, but his reign was short and controversial. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III was defeated and killed by the forces of Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant. With this victory, the Wars of the Roses ended, and the Tudor dynasty began. Henry VII took the throne, marrying Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses. England, exhausted by decades of strife, welcomed the promise of peace. Thus, by the close of the Middle Ages, the kingdom had been utterly transformed. From the Norman Conquest to Magna Carta, from the Black Death to the Wars of the Roses, England had endured war, plague, rebellion, and dynastic bloodshed. Yet it had also seen the birth of Parliament, the rise of English identity, and the dawn of a new dynasty that would carry it into the Renaissance. The saga of fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England does not end here. For while the Middle Ages closed with the Tudors, their rule would open yet another dramatic chapter. But for now, we pause on the battlefield at Bosworth, where one age ended and another began, the rise of Parliament and the shaping of England. As the 14th century dawned, England was already showing signs of becoming something unique in Europe, a kingdom where the authority of kings would increasingly be checked by the demands of nobles, clergy, and eventually the common people. And so, the story of fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England takes another dramatic turn, one shaped not only by battles and monarchs, but by the slow evolution of governance itself. The seeds of this transformation had already been sown during the reign of Edward I. His so-called model parliament of 1295 was a remarkable assembly that brought together not just nobles and bishops, but also knights and burgesses, representatives of the counties and towns. This body was summoned initially to provide financial support for Edward's wars in Wales and Scotland, but its wider significance could not be ignored. For the first time, common voices had been formally called to advise the crown. It was a precedent that would echo throughout the centuries to come. Edward's later years, however, were dominated by the bitter struggles in Scotland. His dream of subduing the northern kingdom faltered against fierce resistance, led by figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. Though Edward died in 1307, believing he was on the cusp of victory, it was his son, Edward II, who inherited the crown, and with it, the seemingly endless war with the Scots. Edward II was, by many accounts, ill-suited to the task of kingship. Unlike his father, he lacked the military discipline and political tact necessary to hold the throne together. His reliance on favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, alienated the great barons of the realm. They viewed these men not only as corrupt influences, but as symbols of the king's weakness. The resentment boiled over into open conflict. The barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster, sought to restrain Edward's power through the ordinances of 1311, which demanded reforms in governance and limited the king's ability to make decisions without broader consent. While Edward resisted, the tide of baronial anger could not be stemmed. The disaster of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce decisively defeated the English army, only deepened Edward's unpopularity. By the late 1320s, his estranged wife, Isabella of France, allied with Roger Mortimer, invaded England and forced Edward's abdication. In a grim chapter of fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England, Edward II became the first English king to be deposed by his own subjects. He was imprisoned, and not long after, he died under mysterious and gruesome circumstances, most likely murdered to prevent his return. Edward III, his son, ascended the throne in 1327 at only 14 years of age. Though initially under the influence of Mortimer and Isabella, Edward soon asserted himself. In 1330, he staged a coup, had Mortimer executed, and placed his mother under house arrest. The new king, unlike his father, displayed both military vigor and political acumen. Edward III's reign was long and transformative. He reinvigorated the chivalric ideals of knighthood, fostered a sense of English identity, and most famously, launched the 100 Years' War with France. The roots of this conflict lay in Edward's claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, daughter of the French king. Though the French rejected this claim, Edward pressed it with a combination of diplomacy and force. The war would define much of the century to come, but it was also under Edward that the institution of Parliament grew stronger. To fund his campaigns, Edward had to call frequent assemblies to request taxation. Each time, Parliament demanded concessions, affirming its right to debate grievances before granting money. What had once been an occasional advisory council was becoming a permanent feature of English governance. At home, Edward's reign was also marked by the creation of the Order of the Garter in 1348, a fellowship of knights sworn to uphold chivalric honor. This was no mere vanity project. It was part of Edward's larger vision of England as a kingdom bound by loyalty, valor, and national pride. Yet, even the most glorious reigns are not without shadows. In the mid-14th century, catastrophe struck with the arrival of the Black Death. Sweeping into England in 1348, the plague decimated the population, killing perhaps one-third or even half of the people. Villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and the social fabric of the kingdom was torn apart. The devastation had profound consequences. With labor in short supply, surviving peasants found themselves in a stronger position to demand better wages and conditions. The old order of serfdom began to crumble, replaced by a more mobile and assertive rural class. While landlords and lords tried to resist these changes through harsh laws like the Statute of Labourers in 1351, the tide could not be turned. England's very social structure was shifting, reshaped by death and survival. Meanwhile, on the battlefields of France, Edward's campaigns brought moments of dazzling success. The victory at Crécy in 1346 showcased the devastating power of English longbowmen, who decimated French knights despite being outnumbered. 10 years later, at Poitiers, Edward's son, the Black Prince, captured the French king himself. These triumphs elevated England to the height of its medieval power, giving it control of vast swathes of French territory. But wars are costly, and by the end of Edward's long reign, the cracks were beginning to show. The crown was heavily indebted, taxation was burdensome, and the early momentum of the 100 Years' War had begun to stall. When Edward III died in 1377, the realm was weary, and leadership passed to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. Richard's reign would prove turbulent, marked by rebellion, tyranny, and ultimately another deposition. Yet before his story unfolds, it is worth pausing to reflect on what the 14th century had already wrought. England was no longer just a feudal kingdom of lords and peasants. It was a land shaped by Parliament, scarred by plague, hardened by war, and increasingly conscious of its own identity. Thus continues fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England, as the medieval kingdom entered a new era, one where the voices of the people grew louder, the authority of kings wavered, and the stage was set for the wars and revolutions to come. The road to modern England and closing reflections. As we move toward the closing chapters of this journey through fall asleep to the entire history of medieval England, the late medieval period brings with it both decline and rebirth. The 15th century was one of turbulence, but also of transformation, laying the groundwork for the England that would soon emerge into the Renaissance and eventually into the early modern world. The Wars of the Roses, already unfolding with deadly intensity, would dominate the last decades of the medieval age. These were not just wars of noble ambition, but conflicts that tore at the very fabric of society. Families found themselves divided, towns and villages caught in the chaos, and kings toppled by rival claimants. The figure of Richard III emerges as both infamous and tragic. A skilled commander and shrewd ruler, he nonetheless became a symbol of tyranny in later memory, thanks in part to Tudor propaganda, immortalized by Shakespeare. His short reign ended dramatically at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where Henry Tudor defeated him and claimed the crown as Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. With that, the Middle Ages in England drew to a close. But medieval England was never simply about kings, battles, and dynasties. It was also about the people, the farmers who worked the land, the merchants who carried goods through the growing towns, the monks who preserved knowledge in quiet libraries, and the countless men and women who lived, loved, prayed, and struggled within the rhythms of their world. As we reflect on the journey, we see how medieval England was shaped by both continuity and change. The Norman Conquest bound England to continental Europe. The Angevin kings extended its reach into France, only to see it crumble in the 100 Years' War. The Black Death reshaped society, breaking the bonds of feudalism and giving rise to new freedoms. The church held immense sway, yet seeds of reform and dissent were already sprouting. And finally, the Wars of the Roses tore apart the nobility, but paved the way for the stability of Tudor rule. This long medieval journey was not simply a bridge between ancient and modern times. It was a world of its own. A world of towering castles and humble cottages, of saints and sinners, of laws and rebellions, of dreams of conquest, and the harsh realities of famine and plague. And so, as we close the story of Fall Asleep to the entire history of medieval England, we leave behind a land transformed. From the Norman invaders of 1066 to the Tudors of 1485, England's medieval centuries were an age of struggle, resilience, and profound change. An age where myths were born, legends written, and foundations laid for the world to come. Now rest easy, letting these echoes of the past drift like whispers through your dreams. The kings, queens, knights, and common folk of medieval England fade back into history, but their story remains, etched forever into the memory of time. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through one of the most fascinating chapters in human history. If you enjoyed traveling through the centuries with me, exploring the triumphs, tragedies, and transformations of England's medieval past, stay with us for more exploration